All right, let's get right into it. Today we're diving into an investigative report that claims to pull back the curtain on a really complex funding network, the one that's supposedly bankrolling a bunch of political activist groups. We're going to follow the money, just like the report does, and see where it leads. So that really gets to the heart of the matter, right? Who is funding modern political activism? I mean, you see these huge, super organized protests pop up, and you have to wonder, where does the money come from? The report we're looking at today treats this whole thing like a detective story, and it all starts with chasing the cash. And you know, every good mystery starts with a single clue. In this story, it's not some big, overarching theory. No, it all kicks off with a trip to Cuba. This trip was the one little thread that investigators started to pull on, and well, it turns out it unraveled a whole lot more. So this youth brigade to Cuba, what's so special about it? Well, take a look at who was there. According to the source, you had some pretty high-profile people, including Ilhan Omar's daughter, Isra Hirsi. The sponsor? An organization called the People's Forum. And leaders from the Palestinian youth movement were there too. The whole thing was apparently centered around this idea of anti-imperialism. Now, to put this trip into perspective, the source brings up some polling data. And wow, the numbers are pretty stark. According to YouGov, only about 12% of Americans have a favorable view of Cuba. 88%? Not so much. The reason the analyst points this out is to show just how much of an outlier a trip like this is compared to what most Americans think.
All right, so the trip to Cuba sets the stage, but it's really just the entry point. The real question is, who's paying for all this? It's time to follow the money trail.
And according to the source, the trail leads to one person in particular. They claim he's the financial linchpin of this whole operation. His name? Neville Roy Singham. The report says his name just keeps popping up, right at the top of the food chain.
So who is this guy? Well, the profile painted by the source is pretty interesting. He's a billionaire and he reportedly lives in China. And the big claim, the core allegation, is that he's the key funder behind this huge global web of activist groups. And yep, that includes the folks who organized that Cuba trip.
Okay, so you've got the billionaire. You've got the money. But how do you turn a pile of cash into actual coordinated action on the street? That's the next piece of the puzzle. The source lays out exactly how they think this network turns funding into influence. Apparently, a really big part of the physical infrastructure here are these places called liberation centers. Think of them as local offices for an organization called the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or PSL for short. The report says these centers are the organizing hubs, the boots on the ground, and that they're functionally just extensions of the People's Forum, the group that sponsored the Cuba trip.
And this is where it gets fascinating. The source lays out a four-step process for how a protest gets organized so quickly. It's not spontaneous, they argue. First, some big event happens. Then, step 2, the local Liberation Center immediately organizes what's called an art build. Basically, people show up and, step 3, they spend all night making signs, banners, the whole 9 yards. And then, step 4, boom. The very next day, a protest hits the streets, looking completely coordinated and ready to go.
So it's not just about protests. The report goes further, claiming that this network's influence is actually seeping into bigger, more mainstream political groups here in the U.S.
And the main example they point to is the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA. The source describes this kind of internal battle happening inside the DSA, a struggle for its ideological direction, and they claim that the groups funded by this network are a major force pushing for that change.
So according to the source, you can basically see two wings of the DSA. You've got the traditional wing, which is all about that Nordic-style social democracy. Think winning elections, policy changes, that sort of thing. But then you have this other rising anti-imperialist wing. Their inspiration, the report says, comes from places like Cuba and other global South movements. And the key allegation is that this second group is really starting to take over. And look, this stuff gets complicated. The analyst behind this report, Stu Smith, even said himself, you really need like a giant mural of your conspiracy board to connect all the dots. And that quote just perfectly captures it, right? It feels like this giant web of names and groups that you can't really grasp until you map it all out. Okay, so if what this report claims is true, what's the solution? The investigation is one thing, but what do you actually do about it? The final part of the source material gets into that.
And what's really interesting is that the solution proposed isn't about going after any one person. The analyst says the key is to look at the system that allows all of this to happen. And that means focusing on the world of nonprofit organizations.
So how do you do that? Well, there's this specific tool called an IRS Form 990. Basically, any tax-exempt organization has to file one of these every year. And here's the kicker. It's public. It's supposed to lay out all their financial info, who's on the board, where the money's coming from, where it's going. It's meant to be a tool for transparency.
So using that Form 990, the source lays out a few concrete steps. First, they say you need to actually staff up the IRS division that's supposed to be watching these nonprofits. Second, have those people really dig into these Form 990s, looking for any red flags of foreign influence. And finally, you've got to close the legal loopholes that allow these kinds of complex structures to exist in the first place. The whole point, they argue, is to stop the nonprofit sector from being exploited.
And all of this really leaves us with one big final question to think about. In a world where funding is globalized, where money can move through these super complex nonprofit networks, what does grassroots activism even mean anymore? It kind of makes you reconsider how we label and understand the political movements we see all around us.